The desert has a particular quality of silence in the hour before a thing arrives. I have stood in it enough times to know the difference between ordinary quiet and the kind that means something has changed in the upper atmosphere. Ordinary quiet is just the absence of wind. The other kind is denser. It sits on the skin. It makes the instruments hum at a slightly lower register, as if the air itself is holding a breath it learned to hold a very long time ago. I was at the lip of the eastern observation shelf when the silence changed. The shelf runs along the rim of the Karath Basin, a natural depression in the high-dent desert. 4 kilometers wide and half a kilometer deep, its walls cut by old water in a time before anyone alive can remember. The basin is not on any civilian map. It hasn't been on one for 11,000 years. What sits inside it looks, from any angle not directly overhead, nothing at all. A stretch of pale rock, a few dry ridgelines, the flat geometry of a basin floor that is baked under the same sun for a very... From directly overhead, even in high-resolution survey, it reads as geology. That effect is not accidental. It took 400 years of patient optical engineering to achieve, and we have maintained it for 80,000 years without a single lapse. My name is Heron Vale. I have held the rank of Range Scout First Class for 31 years. Before that, I did 11 years as a general pattern sensor technician at Meridian Station, which is a very long way from any desert. I came to the basin when I was 42 because a posting opened and I was exactly the right kind of person for it. Not brilliant, not decorated, not especially remarkable in any dimension that shows up on a service record. What I am is patient. I am the kind of patient that some people mistake for stubbornness, and that some others mistake for a simple failure of imagination. Neither of them is wrong. I came to the basin because I understood, the moment I read the assignment description, that the job was not to fight anything. The job was to watch. To stand at the edge of a very old secret, and make sure it remained a secret until the day it was needed. That day was today. I keyed the basin intercom and said in the flat, procedural tone that the basin protocols require for all contact reports. Watch post 7 Alpha. Anomalous upper atmospheric signature, bearing 275 degrees magnetic, elevation 7 to 9 degrees above horizon. Character consistent with deceleration wash from a transorbital insertion burn. Logging contact at 0612 local. Range Scout Vale reporting. This is a formal contact event. There was a pause of perhaps 4 seconds. Then the basin's watch commander, Senior Range Officer Dessa Calm, who had been awake for 18 hours and showed no signs of caring about that, said, "Confirmed, 7 Alpha. Tracking 6 simultaneous signatures now. Make that 8. Elevate to contact protocol 1. All stations acknowledge. 8 ships. I had been told to expect between 7 and 12. The briefing documents we received at the basin, the standing operational archive we call the ledger, because it is exactly that, a record of everything owed and everything prepared. Describe the Sorath Imperium's standard colonial assessment doctrine as a scouting wing of 7 to 12 heavy vessels, dispatched ahead of the main recovery fleet by approximately 14 to 20 standard years. The scouts would arrive, re-establish navigational lock on the old colonial marker network, assess the planetary surface for asset recovery priority, and then transmit their survey forward to the main fleet. That was the doctrine. That was what the Sorath did when they went back to places they had seeded. They had seeded Earth 150,000 years ago. I will not spend long on what that means, because I was not there and neither were you, and the ledger is not a history of grievance. It is a history of preparation. What I can tell you is what the ledger says in its opening section, part that have been copied and recopied, by hand and by machine, through 143,000 years of institutional memory. The Sorath Imperium came to this world in the period we now call the Deep Survey, when humanity was young enough and small enough that the Sorath did not consider us an obstacle worth noting. They planted their markers, deep core beacons, some of them, buried in the lithosphere at precisely calculated depths, broadcasting on frequencies we would not develop the instruments to detect for another 60,000 years. They planted navigational anchors in the orbital shell, artifacts disguised as space debris, locked to the Sorath Stellar Positioning Network. They planted surface cache indicators at 17 sites across the planet. encoding the location of materials they had buried for later retrieval. And then they left. They left because their survey said Earth was not ready to be harvested yet. The markers were their way of remembering where they had been, their way of finding it again. What they did not account for, what, in 150,000 years of colonial practice, they had apparently never encountered, was a species that noticed. We noticed at roughly the 62,000-year mark, when the first of our deep crust seismic arrays detected a signal that had no geological explanation. It took 1,100 years to decode it. It took another 800 to understand what it was doing, that it was not a communication, that it was not a weapon, that it was a flag planted by something that intended to return. And when that understanding finally landed, the institutions that held the ledger did not panic and did not shout, and did not spend a single day in useless rage. They did what the ledger records them doing, in precise, dry administrative language. They convened the first preparation council, they assigned the problem a formal classification, and they began to work. 132,000 years of work. That number sounds extraordinary to anyone who hasn't spent time at the basin. When you have spent enough time here, sounds like exactly what it is. The minimum required effort to do the job correctly. There is a tendency, people first learn about the preparation. Outside the institutions that carry the ledger, I mean, in the general population that has access to the declassified summary records, to frame it as heroic. As if the 63 preparation councils that sat between the first and the one that is sitting right now were populated by people who understood themselves to be living in a heroic moment. They were not. The records are clear on this. Council generations understood itself to be doing maintenance. The first generations discovered the markers and understood the problem and made the initial decisions about approach. Every subsequent generation inherited a specific set of ongoing tasks: maintain the forgery network, extend the kill lane infrastructure, update the ledger, refine the stellar positioning data on the Sarath approach trajectory, check the weapons systems, train the next generation in all of the above, and did them. Not heroically, diligently, the way you maintain anything important over a long time. With attention and without drama, because drama is the enemy of maintenance, and maintenance was the entire point. I thought about this sometimes on long watches. There were a great many long watches at the basin. The basin itself was not the only installation of its kind. I knew that much. The ledger's declassified summary made clear that the basin was one of 14 major preparation sites distributed across the planet, each one chosen for specific geological, strategic, and logistical reasons that the original site selection teams had worked out over several centuries. What I did not know, because the operational details of the other 13 sites were held in their own secure archives and not shared across installations, except at the council level, was exactly what they had built, or how it differed from ours. The ledger's summary suggested a range. Some were oriented toward orbital interdiction, some toward deep system early warning, some toward what it called record preservation, which I had always taken to mean the protection of the ledger itself and its associated archives. The basin was a weapons and engagement site. The kind of place you build when you want to be able to receive something in a controlled environment and respond to it in a controlled way. The word controlled appears a great many times in the ledger. The 8 ships came down through the outer atmosphere in a standard Sorath deceleration pattern. We had the pattern in the ledger, translated from 17 different encounter records, compiled over the last 40,000 years as other species, in other parts of the galaxy, had documented Sorath survey returns. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. A loose V formation, the lead vessel doing the heaviest braking, wingships hanging back to let the commander's sensors clear first. It is the pattern of a force that expects no resistance. They were not in any combat configuration. Their shields were not raised. Their weapons systems, as far as our sensor grid could determine, were on standby. They thought they were flying home. I watched the first ship cross the Terminator line into the basin's outer sensor range from the observation shelf, and I thought about the scout commander aboard that vessel. I did not hate the commander. I am not sure that I am capable of hating something I have never met. something operating according to a colonial doctrine laid down by institutions that existed before my species had developed writing. What I felt, standing on that shelf with the desert cold against my face and the first pale light of morning beginning at the edge of the eastern ridgeline, was something more like a specific, earned, very long-standing irritation. The kind of irritation that comes from having cleaned up the same problem so thoroughly that you almost resent the problem for coming back and requiring you to demonstrate it. We had spent 132,000 years erasing their signs. Every marker, every beacon, every orbital anchor, every surface cache indicator, we found them over time, some quickly, some not for tens of thousands of years. And we did not destroy them outright, because destroying them would have left evidence of destruction, and evidence of destruction is itself a signal. Instead, we studied each one until we understood it completely. Then we either replaced it with a precise forgery, broadcasting on a slightly different frequency, one that would appear correct to a Sorath survey instrument, but would point, instead of to Earth, at a pre-calculated empty approach vector that had to pass through the center of the basin's primary engagement corridor, or we buried it, not destroyed, buried under 300 meters of additional rock, signal dampened by a counter-broadcast array that had been running for 60,000 years, without a single maintenance failure. The ledger records each one. There is a section called the Registry of Signs, and it runs to 47 volumes in its current edition. Each entry describes a marker, its original location, its original broadcast frequency and content, the date it was located, the method used to neutralize or replace it, the date neutralization was confirmed, and the date of the most recent maintenance check. Every entry in the Registry of Signs has been checked within the last 1,000 years. Most have been checked within the last 100. This is not because we were anxious. It is because we are thorough. The lead Sorath vessel broke through the cloud base at approximately 14 kilometers altitude and held there, citing its survey instruments. I could not see it from my position. It was 200 kilometers to my northwest over what used to be an open plain and is now the outer perimeter of the basin's passive sensor field. But the basin's sensor network was seeing it in detail, and the data was feeding to every watch post simultaneously. The ship was roughly 600 meters long, heavily built. It had the functional, graceless look of something designed to last a very long time under hard use, rather than to be admired. The ledger had designations for Sorath vessel classes, compiled from external records, and this one matched the profile of what ledger called a survey heavy, a specialized colonial assessment platform equipped with ground-penetrating radar, deep atmospheric sampling instruments, and an extensive navigational beacon receiver array specifically designed to acquire the Sorath marker network. Its weapons were real and capable, secondary. It was here to read, not to fight. It was reading silence. The beacon acquisition array would be scanning. It would be looking for the deep core signal from the lithospheric marker buried 6 kilometers beneath the surface of the eastern basin, because that marker, or rather, the extraordinarily precise forgery of it that we had maintained for 60,000 years, should have been casting a navigational lock that told the ship it was in the right place, that the old colonial holding was intact, and that it should proceed to the surface cache network for asset confirmation. Instead, forgery was broadcasting the navigational equivalent of an empty road. No colonial lock, no surface cache confirmation, nothing that the ship's systems would recognize as the correct response. Just the background frequency, steady and unremarkable, exactly as we had calibrated it to be. The marker appeared, from the ship's perspective, to be offline. Markers went offline. Equipment failed. 150,000 years was a long time. The scout commander would log it as a technical anomaly and move to the secondary marker network. The orbital anchors, 3 of them, which should have been holding station in the medium orbital shell, disguised as captured debris, and from which the ship should have been able to triangulate a colonial lock precise enough to navigate the entire surface cache system. Those were gone. Not forged in the end. Gone. We had spent 12,000 years carefully confirming that their removal would not leave a detectable trace, and then we had removed them so completely that the orbital shell now contained only what naturally belonged there. The Sorath ship would find nothing at those anchor points. No signal, no debris, no artifact, clean sky. The ship held its position for approximately 19 minutes. Then it descended another 6 kilometers and began a lateral survey sweep, instruments wide open, methodically working through every frequency the Sorath marker network used. We watched it work. We did not interfere. There was no need to interfere. It was not finding anything, and we had already begun the process that would determine the outcome, and that process required no intervention from us at all. It had been running for 60,000 years. What remained was simply to let it complete. The other ships had dispersed across the region in the standard Sorath assessment pattern. A loose perimeter sweep, each ship taking a sector, the commander's vessel holding the center. We tracked all 8 simultaneously from the basin's sensor network. We watched them sweep. We watched them find nothing. Not uniformly none, which might have told them something, but specifically carefully nothing. The kind of nothing that looks, on a survey instrument, like equipment degradation and geological drift, and the ordinary entropy of a very long time. We had calibrated it exactly that way. Every false signal we were broadcasting, every counter-dampening array we were running, every piece of environmental masking we had installed over the course of 80,000 years, all of it was tuned to produce, from the perspective of a Sorath survey instrument, the picture of a world that had simply experienced marker failure, natural failure, the kind of thing that happens when you leave equipment unattended for 150,000 years. It was, in a very specific sense, the most sophisticated lie ever told. I stayed on the shelf for 4 hours. The desert warmed around me slowly, the way high desert always warms, cautiously as if it does not quite trust the sun. Below me the basin looked empty. It looked like geology. It had been looking like geology for so long that sometimes, standing here in the early hours before a shift change, I forgot that it wasn't. That beneath the rock and the optical camouflage and the carefully calibrated sensor masking, there were weapons platforms that had been sitting dormant in their housing for 80,000 years, charged and ready, maintained by automated systems that the basin's maintenance rotation checked by hand every 50 years without exception. There were communication arrays capable of burning a signal to the outer system in less than a second. There were, in the deepest level of the basin's infrastructure, the ledger's primary archive and the hardware that ran the forgery network, both of them hardened to a degree that made the word hardened feel inadequate. Armored against electromagnetic pulse, against directed energy attack, against physical penetration, against everything we had been able to imagine an enemy with 150,000 years of colonial warfare experience might try. We had had a long time to imagine things. At the 4-hour mark, the formation behavior changed. The 2 of the wing ships converged on a point approximately 80 kilometers south of the basin's outer perimeter. The location of one of the false coordinates our forgery network was broadcasting, the signal that mimicked a partially degraded surface cache indicator. We watched them descend to survey altitude and begin a tight spiral scan of the area. The area contained nothing, no cache, no marker, no artifact of any kind. What it contained, beneath 100 meters of sediment, was one of the forgery network's older broadcast nodes, a hardware unit that had been running for 48,000 years and had been serviced at its last maintenance check 12 years ago by a 2-person crew who had descended through a bore shaft the diameter of a standard equipment casing and spent 4 days confirming that every component remained within operational tolerance. The ship scanned for 6 hours. They found the broadcast node's surface signature, a slight thermal differential that we had never been able to fully eliminate, and one of them descended to within 200 meters of the ground. I could follow the event in real time on the watch post's data feed. The ship's ground-penetrating systems would be lighting up the thermal trace, trying to resolve it. They would not be able to resolve it as anything identifiable from their reference library, because it was not in their reference library. It was human technology, 80,000 years old, built from first principles that had nothing to do with Sorath engineering. To their instruments, it would look like a geological thermal anomaly. which is exactly what we had designed it to look like. The two ships held their position for another 3 hours. Then they rose and rejoined the formation. I ate 2 field rations on the shelf and did not go inside. I had waited 31 years for this particular day. I was not going to spend it below ground. At the 11-hour mark, the Sorath commander did something the ledger had predicted as a probable response: total marker failure. The commander's ship descended to 4 kilometers altitude and began a broad-spectrum broadcast on the Sorath Colonial Administration frequency. A general inquiry signal, the kind you send when you expect to find a surface-side receiver that will acknowledge your presence and confirm the holding is intact. It is the equivalent of knocking on a door you expect to be answered. We had anticipated this. Forgery Network produced an acknowledgement signal. Faint, degraded, consistent with a surface receiver that had been running on backup power for a very long time, that told the ship's instruments it had located a receiver at a specific set of coordinates, approximately 240 kilometers north of the basin. The coordinates pointed to the mouth of one of the 3 approach corridors that the basin's engagement doctrine called the primary kill lanes. Dead straight approaches flanked by ridgelines that had been for 80,000 years the housing of the basin's longest-range weapons platforms. The commander, to their credit, did not immediately follow the signal. They held for another 3 hours. They swept additional frequencies. They consulted. The Basin Signals Intelligence Section could not intercept the content of the ship-to-ship communications, but the traffic pattern was readable, and the pattern said, discussion, uncertainty, recalibration. 7 ships checking in with the commander issuing revised instructions, ships repositioning. A new sweep pattern, tighter, concentrating on the region around the false coordinates. 7 hours of that. It is a strange thing watching an enemy work. It is stranger still when the enemy is working very hard and finding nothing because you arranged, with great precision, there to be nothing for them to find. There is a quality to it that is not satisfaction and not relief and not triumph. It is closer to the feeling you get when a piece of engineering you designed and built and tested over many years performs exactly as the specification requires. Quiet confirmation. The system is doing what the system was built to do. The Basin Signals Intelligence Section estimated, at the 20-hour mark, that the Sorath commander had now flexfixed the situation as a priority alpha anomaly and transmitted a preliminary report to the main fleet. We could not intercept the content of that transmission, which was encrypted and directional. We could see the burst pattern and identify it as consistent with a fleet priority report. The main fleet, 14 years out, was now aware that the scout wing had encountered unexpected conditions. Whether the commander's preliminary report characterized those conditions as marker failure and equipment degradation, or as something more concerning, we could not determine. What we could determine was that the situation had moved from a local assessment problem to fleet-level awareness event. This was fine. This was anticipated. The Ledger's operational doctrine for the engagement had always assumed that a preliminary report would go out before any confrontation occurred. The content of that preliminary report was now less important than what we were about to transmit, which would supersede it. At the 22-hour mark, Range Officer Calm's voice came across the basin intercom with the controlled flatness that the protocols require and that Calm deployed with the particular ease of someone who had been trained in it since the age of 6. All stations, weapon systems status report requested. Basin Control acknowledges contact protocol is active. All weapons to stand by warm, not hot. Authorization code Ledger 7 Delta. Confirm on my mark. The confirmation went around the loop in under 8 seconds. I had my hands on the authorization panel when it happened, not because I was going to fire, not yet, because the panel's contact surface is warm. And I found in that moment that I needed something warm to hold on to. The desert around me was very cold. The sun had been down for 6 hours. The stars were extraordinary, the way they always are in the high desert when there is no wind and no humidity. Hard and clear and very close. The way stars look when the air does not have the decency to soften them. Hold, Calm said then. We are transmitting the formal record now. This was the part I had read about in the Ledger's operational doctrine, and the part that every training session at the basin emphasizes with an insistence that at first seems excessive, and later seems barely sufficient. For if any A weapon is fired, Earth transmits. Not a warning, a record. The Ledger's transmission protocol is a compressed burst, formatted to the Sarath Colonial Administration Standard, so their receivers can parse it without translation. And it contains the following: full registry of every marker they planted, cross-referenced against the date it was located by human instruments, the date it was neutralized, and the method used. 147 markers, each one documented. The full technical specifications of the forgery network, exactly what we replaced each marker with, exactly what frequencies we have been broadcasting, exactly how long we have been broadcasting them, the coordinates of every kill lane and every weapons platform, the effective range and yield of every weapon system the basin currently operates, drawn from maintenance records that go back 80,000 years. And, at the end of the transmission, navigational data for the approach vectors into Earth's orbital space, with a notation in Sorath Colonial Administrative Standard that reads, "This information is provided so that you understand what you have entered and can make an informed decision about what you do next." We transmitted this to all 8 ships simultaneously. We then waited 30 seconds. The 30 seconds mattered. The Ledger's doctrine on this point was written by someone I have always privately referred to as the patient philosopher of the Council. Not because I know who they were. The author notation is simply an institutional designation, because the reasoning behind the 30-second interval is articulated in the doctrine with a care that feels personal. The 30 seconds are not a pause. They are an offer. They are the specific period in which the Sorath commander can review enough of what they have received to understand that they have a choice, and make it before the situation moves into a register where choice becomes more complicated. The doctrine reads, "Do not deny a thinking being the moment to think. We are not here to ambush, we are here to answer." The ship in the northern corridor stopped moving. It held position for approximately 15 seconds. Then it began to reverse. That was not fast enough. Calm's voice when it came was exactly as flat as it always was. "Northern platform, target is in range. Single shot, disabling yield. Fire." I did not see the shot from the observation shelf. The northern corridor is not visible from the eastern shelf. They are separated by 12 kilometers of ridgeline. What I saw was the light, a hard, brief, blue-white pulse that illuminated the underside of the cloud deck for perhaps 2 seconds, and then was gone. The basin sensors told me the rest. A single high-energy pulse from the northern platform's primary emitter, calibrated to disable rather than destroy, striking the wing vessel amidships. The ship did not explode. Its drives went dark and it descended hard into the corridor floor, a controlled crash rather than a catastrophic one. The disable calibration was specific. We had been maintaining the basin's targeting data on Sorath vessel shielding and structural specs for 50,000 years, and the shot was placed as precisely as 40 years of weapons maintenance can place a shot. The crew of that ship, insofar as we could determine from sensor returns, survived. We did not do them the disservice of pretending they were a threat we needed to destroy. The formation changed in the next 60 seconds. The 4 ships holding at altitude began emergency ascent burns. 2 orbital ships had already broken into a higher orbit. The commander's Survey Heavy held its position for 43 seconds. I noted the time, because 43 seconds is a long time to hold still when your formation is in retreat, and so found myself unexpectedly feeling something very close to respect for whoever was on that bridge, working through the implications of what they had just received. And then began its own ascent burn. They were leaving, not all of them, Vale. Calm's voice again. "Watch Post 7 Alpha, standing by. Eastern perimeter sensor is tracking a ground vehicle launch from the downed ship. Small, wheeled, single occupant, appears to be in a pressure suit. Vehicle is moving toward the outer sensor perimeter at slow speed. This is consistent with a surrender gesture per Sorath Colonial Protocol. We have verified the protocol against the Ledger's reference index. Firm receipt." "Confirmed," I said. "What are my instructions?" There was a pause. Not a long one. Calm was not the kind of person who paused from uncertainty. When she paused, it was because she was choosing words carefully. Maintain observation. Do not approach. Open channel 77 on the basin standard colonial contact frequency and transmit our acknowledgement of the gesture. Let them sit. When the rest of the formation has cleared the outer system, basin control will issue further instructions on the ground contact. Stood. I opened channel 77. I transmitted the acknowledgement. Is a 12-second signal burst is in the Sorath Colonial Administrative Standard, and which translates to something that is not quite English and not quite anything else, but which means, functionally, we see you, and we will deal with you when we are ready. Then I watched. The vehicle had stopped approximately 2 kilometers inside the outer sensor perimeter. It was just sitting there on the flat desert floor, with its occupant inside, in a pressure suit, at the edge of the most thoroughly prepared military installation on the planet. Surrounded by nothing that looked like anything at all. The rest of the Sorath formation took 4 hours to clear the outer system. We tracked every ship. They did not attempt to regroup. They did not attempt any additional communication. They went the way they had come, in the direction of the false orbital anchor coordinates, which of course pointed at nothing. We had arranged that precisely years ago, so that when a retreating force tried to use the forgery network as a navigation aid, it would take them on a specific outbound trajectory that would require them to make a certain number of course corrections before they could plot a clean route home, and each of those course corrections would eat time and fuel, chilling. And by the time they arrived home, they would have spent enough time traveling to make the main fleet's scheduled departure significantly complicated. We had not designed this delay to be crippling. We had designed it to be sufficient. Sufficient to send a message in the most practical language available. We thought about everything. When the last ship's drive signature faded from the outer system sensor network, Calm gave the order to stand down the weapons systems from hot to warm. We did not go to cold. We would not go to cold until we had a formal assessment of what the main fleet was going to do with what the scout wing would tell it. That assessment would take some time. In the meantime, there was a Sorath pilot sitting in a small vehicle in the desert, 2 kilometers inside the outer sensor perimeter of the Kareth Basin Defense Range, in a pressure suit in the dark. 7 Alpha, Calm said. Sir, you are the closest watch post to the ground contact. You are going to walk out there. Standard approach protocol. Unarmed, lights on, slow pace. The contact appears to be complying with the surrender gesture standard. Confirm when you begin approach. I looked out at the desert. 2 kilometers. In the dark, on the basin floor without any path. Confirmed, I said, beginning approach. I came down from the shelf by the standard access route. A long switchbacked set of steps cut into the rock face. Old enough that the edges of some of the steps have been worn smooth by 30 years of my own boots and those of the 11 watch officers who held this post before me. At the base of the steps there is a small equipment locker. I took a standard issue scout lamp, activated it, and started walking. The basin floor is hard-packed sediment with a light gravel cover. It makes a specific sound underfoot, not quite a crunch, quite a scuff, somewhere between the two, that I have heard so many times it registers as silence to me. Now, the night was clear. The stars were the same extraordinary ones I had been looking at from the shelf. The lamp threw a wide, flat pool of light around me, sufficient to see by without washing out the star field entirely. I thought, walking, about the people who had built the basin, not the institutional history, the council decisions, and the engineering specifications, and the maintenance logs, but the individual people, the ones who had done the actual physical work of cutting the kill lanes into the ridge lines, and installing the web platforms and running the bore shafts for the forgery network's broadcast nodes. None of those people had known when the day would come. Most of them had known with certainty that it would not come in their lifetime. They had built things they would never see used. They had maintained things that would not be needed for 10,000 years after they were gone. They had trained their successors in procedures that might not be executed for another 20 generations. There is a word in the ledger for this. A formal institutional term used in the operational doctrine to describe the disposition required of everyone who carries the preparation through a generation that will not see its completion. The word translates awkwardly from the administrative language the ledger uses for technical terms, but the closest English rendering is something like held readiness, the specific state of being fully prepared for something that has not yet happened and may not happen for a very long time, without allowing that waiting to become either impatience or resignation. It is not hope, exactly. It is not faith, exactly. It is more like the posture of someone who has done everything right correctly and is now simply waiting for the situation to resolve itself in the only way it can, given what has been done. I had been in held readiness for 31 years. I was walking out of it now. The vehicle was a small, boxy, six-wheeled thing. Functional-looking, utilitarian, built to the same graceless standard as the ships. It was not large. It could seat perhaps 2 people, if those people were comfortable being very close together, and the single occupant inside had pushed the forward observation panel to its maximum angle and was watching my approach from behind it. Pressure suit was a standard Soreth field configuration. As far as I could tell, nothing I hadn't seen in the Ledger's technical archive. The occupant's face was visible through the suit's visor. Soreth are bilaterally symmetrical. Broadly, the overall geometry of their faces is not entirely unlike ours, which is one of the reasons the Ledger's xenobiologists believe our evolutionary paths may have shared a common pressuring environment a very long time ago. But the differences are significant enough to register as alien rather than familiar. The eyes are larger and set slightly wider angle. The face is longer. The jaw is built for a different kind of work than ours. And the color of the skin is a greenish-gray that has nothing in common with any human coloration. The expression on this particular Soreth's face was difficult to read. That is not unusual. The Ledger has extensive documentation on Soreth facial expression mapping, compiled from observed records, and even with that reference, individual interpretation is uncertain. What I was reasonably certain I was reading, in that face, was exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of someone who had just survived a crash and a pressure suit and 2 hours sitting alone in a dark desert, though there was certainly some of that, the other kind. The exhaustion of someone who has just processed a great deal of new information very quickly and has not yet found a way to reorganize their understanding of the world to accommodate it. I stopped 3 meters from the vehicle. I turned off the lamp. I let my eyes adjust. After a moment, the vehicle's forward panel slid fully open. The Sorath inside looked at me. I looked back. I said, "Ch." In the Sorath Colonial Administrative Standard that I had spent 11 years studying before my posting to the basin, the formation has cleared our outer system. You were left behind by choice. Ch. We understand as a conventional gesture, indicating the desire for a formal record to be established. We will accommodate that. Pause was not as long as I expected. Soreth said, in a voice that was slightly rougher than the recordings in the Ledger and slightly slower, with a careful precision that suggested I was not the first language being thought in before the second was spoken. 150,000 years. I said, yes, the markers, all of them. 147. The registry was transmitted to your formation. Your command staff has the complete documentation. Another pause. The Soreth's large eyes moved across the basin, slowly taking in the darkness that revealed nothing, then came back to me. How long have you been waiting? This is not an easy question to answer, because the answer is not one number and not one generation. The answer is, since we understood what the markers meant. Since the first preparation council convened. Since the first forged beacon went online. Since the first kill lane was cut into the ridgeline. Since the first maintenance crew went out in the dark to check the weapons platforms and found them exactly as they had been left, and went home again without telling anyone because there was nothing worth telling. Everything was as it should be. Since the first archivist sat down with the first edition of the Ledger and began the work of copying it by hand into the second, the answer is everyone who ever stood at this basin or at any of the other installations across this world. Everyone who ever held the watch when there was nothing to see and held it anyway. But I did not say any of that, because the question was not really asking for a number, I said. Long enough. The Soreth looked at me for a long time then. The main fleet is scheduled at 14 years behind us. Standard doctrine. We know the doctrine. We will carry your record. complete transmission. What you have shown us will not be misrepresented. We expect it won't be, I said. The record is complete. The calibration of our weapon systems is documented. The extent of the forgery network is documented. The main fleet's commanders will have everything they need to make an accurate assessment of what they will face if they continue on the published schedule. That assessment, the Sorath said, and here there was a pause of a different kind, a carefully managed pause, the kind that precedes something being said for the first time, will not be favorable to continuation. No, I said, it won't. We stood there in the dark for a while. Above us, the stars wheeled, with the same slow patience they have always had. I thought about the Sorath colonial doctrine, as the ledger described it. A vast, patient enterprise, seed worlds with markers, turn after the appointed interval. Assess, harvest. The intervals were long enough that individual generations of Sorath would not see the cycle complete. They inherited the doctrine the way we inherited the preparation, through institutions older than personal memory. I had wondered, in the years I spent reading the ledger, whether the Sorath who arrived today understood themselves to be doing something morally wrong, or whether the colonial practice was, from the inside, simply the ordinary work of a civilization doing what civilizations do. I still did not know the answer. It was not a question the ledger addressed, because the ledger is not a document of moral philosophy. It is a document of preparation. What happens after the preparation is complete is a question for the next document. Eventually, I said, therefore facilities at the basin, cherized. A standard atmospheric composition, which I understand is incompatible with Sorath field suit transition protocol, medical assistance if required. You will be held as a formal contact, not as a prisoner. When the basin's command authority has completed its initial documentation of this event, you will be given the opportunity to make a personal statement for the record, and arrangements will be made for your repatriation at a time of mutual convenience. The Sorath was quiet for a moment, then, the one you disabled, crew. We have sensor confirmation that the crew survived the landing. Recovery teams are en route to the northern corridor. They will be treated the same as you. You planned for that also. We planned for most things. The Sorath looked at the desert again, could not tell what they were looking for in it. Maybe nothing. Maybe they were simply doing what I had been doing for 31 years, looking at a thing that appeared to be nothing at all, and trying to see what was actually there. Finally, they said, "When did you know we were returning?" "We have known the approximate timing of your inspection cycle for 40,000 years. The precise arrival window was narrowed to a 3-year range, approximately 1,200 years ago, when the last refinement of your stellar positioning data was completed. The exact date was confirmed by your approach signature approximately 31 hours ago." 40,000 years, the Sorath said. Not quite a question. 40,000 years of preparation. On top of the 92,000 years before that. 132,000 years in total from the first preparation council to today. I watched the Sorath process that. It took a while. I did not rush it. I had waited 31 years, and the institution behind me had waited 132,000. Another few minutes was not a hardship. "Your people," the Sorath said eventually, "have a very long memory." "Yes," I said, "we do." I let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to sit. Then I reached into my field pack and produced a standard emergency lighting stick, the kind you carry for situations where your primary lamp fails, and activated it and set it on the ground between us, where it threw a warm, yellow-orange light that was adequate for walking and not much else. "When you are ready," I said, "I will walk you in." We crossed the basin floor together, the two of us, under the stars that had been overhead for 150,000 years. The Sorath walked carefully, adjusting to the uneven ground with a deliberation that suggested the pressure suit was not ideally suited to walking any distance in low gravity. I matched their pace without thinking about it. It is a habit you develop when you walk a lot of ground alone. You become very good at adjusting to whatever pace the terrain requires. The basin was cold and very still and completely silent, except for the sound of our footsteps on the gravel and the faint mechanical sound of the Sorath suit managing its atmosphere. Somewhere behind me, in the northern corridor, Recovery teams were moving toward the downed ship. Somewhere above me, in the medium orbital shell, the clean sky that had once held 3 Soreth navigational anchors held nothing but what had always belonged there. In the deep rock beneath my feet, 147 documented positions where markers had once been planted and had been placed or silenced now held only the forgery network's steady, patient hum. Still broadcasting, because we would continue broadcasting until we had formal confirmation from the main fleet's command authority that the colonial schedule had been formally withdrawn. We did not stop doing things until they were finished. Inside the basin, in the primary briefing room, 2 levels below the rock surface, Senior Range Officer Calm would be writing the first contact report, not the log entry, the full formal report, the one that would go to the Continental Authority, and from there to the Planetary Council, and from there into the Ledger's current edition, as the first entry in the chapter that had been waiting, blank, for 132,000 years. Chapter A heading, which had been set in the current edition for 900 years, and which previous editions had reserved under a placeholder, going back further than that, read simply, the accounting. 40,000 years ago, the refinement of the Sorath's stellar positioning data had first confirmed the approximate inspection cycle. The Ledger's then current archivist had written a note in the margin of the chapter page. The note was not procedural. It was personal, which was unusual for Ledger marginalia. And it had been preserved through every subsequent edition because the institution considered it accurate enough to be worth keeping. It read, "When the day comes, it will not feel like victory. It will feel like the completion of a very long job of work. Do not mistake one for the other. The work is the point. The work was always the point." I had read that note many times. I had read the whole ledger, all 47 volumes plus the registry of signs, for the course of my 11 years at Meridian Station and my 31 years at the Basin. I had read it not because anyone required me to, but because it seemed to me the right thing to do to understand the full scope of what I was a part of before I stood at the edge of it and looked out. The note was right. This did not feel like victory. It felt like the morning after a job completed. The particular quality of stillness that follows a sustained effort, when the effort has been exactly sufficient, and nothing more was required. Not triumphant, not relieved, just done, or rather, the first part done. The second part, the main fleet 14 years distant, with the complete record in its communications archive, was still ahead. That was not today's work. Today's work was to write the first entry in the chapter called The Accounting, and to walk a Soreth pilot across the basin floor and to confirm, for the record, that 147 markers had been erased, and that the world they had marked was still here, and that it had been here the entire time, and that it had spent the interval in exactly the way it chose. The Sorath said nothing else until we reached the entrance to the basin's surface, access level, where the door is set into the rock wall and looks, from any angle, like rock. I pressed my hand to the reader and the door opened. Warm light and warm air came out into the cold desert. The Soreth looked at the door for a moment, then at me. 150,000 years, they said again. Not quite the same way as before. The first time had been shock. This time was something more like comprehension, the word arriving in a different part of the mind than the first time, landing in a place where it could be held properly and examined from all sides. 150,000 years, I confirmed. Every marker, every signal, everything you left here to find your way back. I held the door. None of it is here anymore. The Sorath held my gaze for 3 seconds. Then they stepped inside. I let the door close behind us and stood in the warm light of the entryway and listened to the desert outside, which was already back to its particular quality of silence. The ordinary kind, now, not the other kind. The holding breath, released. The long work settling into itself, the way a very old structure settles when the load it was built for is finally applied and found exactly within its tolerances. Somewhere in the Ledger's primary archive, the registry of signs was complete. Every entry checked, every marker accounted for, every sign erased. We had made very sure they could not find the way back. And then, we waited for them to come and discover it for themselves, the way you wait for a thing when you have done everything that patience and memory and preparation and discipline can do. And the only thing left is time. And time is something we have always understood how to use. We had used it well. That was all there was to say about it, and it was enough. In the days that followed, I wrote my own section of the contact report. Every watchfusser at the basin who had been on duty during the event was required to submit a first-hand account, not a log summary, but a personal narrative, in their own words, describing what they observed and what they did. This is a tradition in the basin protocols that dates back to an early preparation council decision, and the reasoning behind it is explained in a footnote that has been carried forward in every subsequent edition of the protocols. Institutional memory is not only what happened, it is also what it felt like to be there when it happened. Both matter. The formal record captures one. The personal accounts capture the other. I had never written a personal account before, because nothing had ever happened at the basin that required one. In 31 years, my entries in the basin's operational log were almost uniformly routine. Shift change, sensor checks, maintenance confirmations, the occasional minor calibration adjustment when a watch post instrument drifted outside its operational tolerance range. There is a standardized format for all of it, and I had filled out that format several thousand times, and I was very good at it. Writing a personal account was different. It required me to say what things had felt like rather than what they had registered, and I found that harder than I expected. Not because I didn't know what it had felt like, because the feeling was one that I had no previous experience describing, and the closest I could get. After 3 drafts, each of which Calm reviewed and returned with the notation needs more specificity, was this. It felt like the ending of a sentence that had been started 132,000 years before I was born. Not a resolution, a completion. The distinction mattered to me. Resolution implies a problem solved. Completion implies a sentence that was always going to end this way, given what came before it, and simply needed to reach its final word. Calm read the 4th draft and made no notations. She returned it with the basin's authentication stamp and the notation, approved for archive. I do not think she particularly agreed with my framing. But she is a practical person, and the practical assessment was that it was specific enough to be useful and honest enough to be true, which are the 2 qualities the protocols require of a personal account. The Sorath formal contact, we never learned their name. The Ledger's protocol for formal contacts lists them only by their vessel designation and the contact event classification number. Remained at the basin for 37 days before the repatriation arrangements were completed. During that time, they were housed in the basin's auxiliary pressurized section, fed on dietary provisions that the basin's logistics team had sourced from the Ledger's archive of Sorath nutritional requirements. Another document that had been sitting in the archive for 43,000 years, waiting to be used, and given access, under supervision, to a review copy of the formal transmission we had sent to the Scout Wing. I visited them once, at the 11-day mark, personal basis rather than an official one. I am not entirely sure why. Calm did not ask me to, and the protocols did not require it, and there was no operational reason for the visit. I think the reason was simpler than any of that. I had walked 2 kilometers across a dark desert to meet this individual, and I wanted to know whether the conversation we had had at the edge of the basin was the only one we would ever have. It was not. We spoke for approximately 2 hours. The Sorath's command of the Colonial Administrative Standard was significantly more fluent than the first night had suggested. The care in their speech at the vehicle had been deliberate, not a limitation. We talked about the forgery network in some technical detail, because they wanted to understand how it had been done, and explaining the broad architecture of what 132,000 years of iterative engineering produces is a good way to spend 2 hours with someone who has a sufficiently technical background to follow it. We talked about the deep core beacons and the counter-dampening arrays and the optical camouflage and the way the thermal signature problem had never been fully solved, but had been managed to a level that was indistinguishable from natural variation in the available survey instruments. The Sorath asked careful questions and listened to the answers with the attention of someone taking notes they will carry back with them, At the end of 2 hours, they asked one question that was not technical. They said, "Did you ever consider simply destroying the markers, placing them, not forging them, destroying them outright and giving us no signals at all?" At follow, I said. "We considered it. The first preparation council considered it at length. The conclusion, which is documented in the ledger, and has never been formally revisited, because subsequent councils agreed with the reasoning, was that destruction was insufficient. A world with no markers is a world you might return to anyway, out of curiosity or habit, or the ordinary logic of expansion. A world where the markers have been replaced with something that knows you are coming. That is a different kind of message. We did not want to make you uncertain about returning. We wanted you to return and find the answer waiting. The answer is more useful to both of us than the uncertainty." The Sorath was quiet for a moment. Then, "The answers are being that you are here, and you were ready, and you have been ready for longer than our colonial program has existed in its current form." "Yes," I said. "That is the answer." They did not say anything else about that. We talked for a short time after about something less significant. The specific quality of the light in the high desert in the early morning, which the Sorath had observed through the auxiliary section's pressurized window and found in their word, arresting. I said that I had found it arresting too, every morning for 31 years. There was a silence after that, which was not uncomfortable. Did not visit again. The repatriation transport arrived at the 37-day mark, and the Sorath formal contact departed with the crew from the northern corridor, all 17 of them, under an escort arrangement that the basin's command authority had coordinated with 3 other continental installations over the preceding month. The transport took them to a neutral orbital point, where a vessel was waiting, not Sorath military. The ledger's protocols had specified that explicitly. A commercial carrier, under a charter arrangement with no political affiliation, and they transferred there and were gone. The basin's record of the contact closed with the transport's departure. The chapter called The Accounting now had its first entry. The main fleet was at that point approximately 13 years and 5 months distant. Calm gave the basin a 4-hour stand-down after the transport left. Not a celebration. The protocols do not provide for celebrations, and Calm would not have implemented one if they had. But a 4-hour period in which the watch rotations were reduced to minimum coverage and the rest of the staff were released from duty requirements. Most people slept. Some of them went to the basin's small common room and sat together without saying much. I went back to the observation shelf. The desert was the same. It is always the same, which is part of what makes it useful for this work. The basin floor, 4 kilometers wide and half a kilometer deep, baked and pale and silent, looked exactly as it had looked from this shelf for 31 years. There was no evidence, from any angle, that anything had happened here. The optical camouflage was intact. The weapons platforms were back in their housings. The forgery network was still broadcasting. The ledger was in its archive. The registry of signs was complete. Somewhere in the northern corridor, 12 kilometers away behind the ridgeline, the disabled Sorath-wing vessel was sitting on the corridor floor, with its drives dark, its hull intact, a 600-meter piece of evidence that would go into the archive. And eventually, when the formal accounting with the main fleet was complete, be studied with the same thoroughness with which we had studied every other piece of Sorath technology we had ever encountered. There was a lot to learn in a 600-meter hull. There was always more to learn. The sun went down behind the western ridgeline, and the stars came out. The same hard, clear stars that had been overhead for 150,000 years. I stood on the shelf and watched them for a while, the way I had watched them on every night watch for 3 decades. They looked the same, as they always had. That seemed right. A thing that takes 132,000 years to complete should not, upon its completion, cause the stars to change. The stars are not required to acknowledge it. The work was not done for acknowledgement. It was done because it needed doing, and because the people who needed to do it had done it, generation by generation, without fail. First preparation council to the last watch before the scouts arrived. Harren Vale, Range Scout, First Class, 31 years at the Karath Basin Defense Range, Watch Post 7 Alpha. I held the watch. I held it still.